the ergonomics of the space, how people move through it. And certainly if they're a good architect, it explains how the architect has created space, enough space to let more people go through or only let a few people go through. I think it's a very important part of architectural design, the design of space in relation to people. So I'm always thinking about it and I'm always working on it. But I have to be careful because I think human beings are interested, they're interested in architecture and things, but they're really interested in people. And if you have people who are too close, too much the dominant subject of the picture, the viewer will look at the people and they will miss the architecture. So I have to get a balance. Yeah, so think about that. If you're making a picture of architecture and there are people in it, just be careful that the people don't take over. Yeah? Because we all look and we check them out, you know, we go, ooh, he's a good looking guy. I like that. You know? So, you know, you have to be careful, okay? But don't ignore people, right? I try and get a balance. And actually sometimes, in fact quite often actually, I'll make two pictures. I'll make the same picture with and without people. And I'm thinking about the usage that the client will make of it. Okay? Some architects don't want to show people, they just want to show the design, and others are the opposite, and then others are in between. So I'm always thinking about how the photographs will be used, and I think that's very important. And I'll talk about that. I'll talk about that up front when I go to meet an architect. Now, it's about the brief. The brief, to my mind, is very important. They generally, at the end of the day, they're fairly similar, but I need to know, I mean, if it's someone who I haven't worked with before, I need to know where they're coming from, what they want the pictures for, how they're going to use them, any biases such as people know people, nighttime pictures, etc., etc. Okay? And I'll probably talk further about the brief a bit later. Now this is by Zarnes Associates, and this is also actually another hotel, but it's a youth hostel in Sydney, and it's in a part called The Rocks, which is a really old part of Sydney. And it's like 200 years old, and you know, really old. No? And the interesting part about this building was that it was built over the top of an archaeological site. So in this old part of Sydney were some old buildings that had been knocked down, so they had left a remnant facade of the old buildings to give an idea of scale and obviously just refer to these old buildings. And then they've literally suspended the building above the archaeological digs, which are still going on. So there is a team of archaeologists assigned to this site, and they come in on a regular basis and do some work. So this open air atrium space looks down onto one of the sites. And I thought Zarnes handled this really, really well, because it incorporated from a street level view. This is in, you know, the historic part of Sydney. So there's a lot of tourists, a lot of visitors, and there is basically an ongoing open air, free museum for visitors who will just wander through what was, you know, an old laneway, and they can get a little glimpse of Sydney's colonial history. Now, we're still in the city of Sydney, and this is a building called 1 Bligh Street, and it was designed by an Australian practice called Architectus in conjunction with a German practice, Ingenhoven. Now, I didn't actually photograph the building, except in relation to the interior fit-out of a number of floors for my client, who was Bates Smart. But obviously I'm standing within the atrium space, looking across the atrium at the main part of this commercial building. The architect's client is a law firm, and I had to do a whole series of pictures, photographing their fit-out, photographing, I mean, I'm showing the more interesting pictures, but there were some very straightforward pictures of, you know, office fit-outs and joinery and petitions and things like that, and that's not unusual as well. But these more interesting aspects were fun. I think they did a really good job. And again, there was a mixture of empty spaces and people spaces. And very often, you know, architects don't have big budgets. These aren't advertising shoots. They can't hire models. They literally corral people from the office and they drag them in and hand them over to me, and I have to turn them into, well, in this instance, lawyers. You know, they're clients of lawyers. So, gee, it looks a bit wooden actually now. But you know, it's you know, I have to work with what I'm given, and usually the case is we have one chance. This is the time. We have to go in there and be as prepared as we can with the resources that we have, and we have to do the best we can. There's a reverse dusk shot. How about that? So again, even from an interior, you can give a sense of location. Now, to contrast that project, this is by the firm Collins and Turner, who are a young up-and-coming firm. I do a lot of work with them. They're very fine designers. And this interesting structure is it's a youth facility. You know, it's a community centre, and it's in the inner city part of Sydney. It's in a rough part of town, actually. And there's a skate park next to it, and you know, there's, you know, not that Sydney's terribly rough city, but there's social unrest in this part of the city, and this centre has been built to provide facilities for local kids. Mm-hmm. So what I liked about the structure was that it immediately connected to the skate park, which was existing. But this sort of, you might say, sort of esoteric sort of superstructure that surrounds what is essentially just a concrete and glass box that houses the facility. In fact, they had to work with the existing structure. There was an existing structure there which used to be a public toilet. So the architects had to work with that shell, but they had to make something of it. So they built this other structure around it, and it's been designed for the vegetation to grow over it and blend in with the surrounding treescape, and I think that will work. But I had lots of fun playing with the local boys and girls, and this was kind of funny. I mean, I had the picture there. I mean, the guys were going up and down that on a regular basis, and I didn't even think that. Of course, I like the way his arms are mimicking the structure behind him, and I could say I planned that, but I didn't. So there's always a little bit of, you know, surprise that can happen, which is good. You know, I'm not perfect, things just happen, and sometimes I get lucky. And that's the view from there. There's a little rooftop terrace. Now, this building is by Australia's, not me anymore, but he certainly was. He was Australia's preeminent and most famous architect, Harry Seidler, who passed away a few years ago. And he was an old school modernist, a very fine architect, and he paved the way for modern architecture from the 1950s to this day. And this was apparently the last building he designed. And this picture and the next one give you another example of how, you know, I have to work with the local conditions. Now, the great thing about, to my mind, the thing I like about architecture is that it doesn't move. It's always there, very consistent, unlike photographing people. I don't know how those photographers do it, because people move and they have opinions. You know? Buildings generally don't.
Oh, animal.
Hey?
Animal.
Animals. Oh, think about that. But of course, the one thing that does change, and changes all the time, is the light. So, you know, a picture like that, it was one of those days where there was clouds just coming past and the sun was coming in and coming out, and, you know, you set up, or at least when I was setting up for this particular picture, I can't actually recall, I was probably setting up for this picture, yeah, with the sun out, but of course when the sun went away, there was a very different feel to it, and so I just stayed and I used that light, and I made 2 pictures, and you know, this is literally within a second. It can change from that to that, and I think that's it just goes to show you how important light is. But it's a very fine building. It's just it's a commercial office building. I think it was commissioned by the Alliance Française. But Seidler was very well known for his spiral staircases. Now, I mentioned earlier that Australia has a lot of fine residential architecture, and this house is designed by Peter Stutchbury on the northern beaches in Sydney, is one such example. There's a little story connected with this. When I was making the pictures, the owners, who were very nice people, they told me their story about how they got to know and how they commissioned Peter Stutchbury to design this house. They had a house right on the beach, an old house. They wanted a new house. They chose Peter Stutchbury, whose practice was literally up the beach, you know, a few hundred metres away, and so they invited Stutchbury in. They commissioned him, and then Stutchbury went away, and they thought, oh good, I guess we'll see some plans or drawings in a week or a couple of weeks or whatever, and Stutchbury would pop in on his way to work, and then he'd drop by for a cup of tea in the afternoon, and he'd go for surf in the morning, and he'd drop in and say hello, and this went on for weeks, not just weeks, but months. And the owners are thinking, when's he going to actually show us something? I mean, we commissioned him months ago. And I think it was like 4 or 5 months later, he turned up with a little model, and he said, okay, here's your house. That's what it's going to look like. And the owners went, what? Is that it? I mean, you're not going to show us any plans or ideas? We don't get to choose anything? Or he's going, no. All the time I've been dropping in, I've been looking at the light, I've been feeling the wind, I've been, just absorbing the sight. And with that, he went away, and he was obviously working, but he worked it all out. And he had come up with a solution, and here was the solution. And then he went through this solution, and he explained how he came to this conclusion. He explained how all these elements were designed, and why they were there, and the owners just had to agree. They had to just go, well, that's it, he's right. And they went for it, and just like that. And it was literally built almost exactly as Stutchbury had designed it. Now, I think that's a really important aspect for architect students. The site, the location, buildings must be designed for their location. It's almost crucial, because if they're not, you can be wasting all sorts of, certainly you can find it wasting money, but you'll be wasting good opportunities to make the most of a given place. And of course, a lot of these buildings, and it's a home designed for a family. They've only had 3 or 4 bedrooms. But we're fortunate in Australia. As I said, we've got space. So spaces can be bigger than what you would expect in Europe or in Asia. I should point out that the owner is Japanese Australian. Mm-hmm. And she had this existing Japanese garden, which Stutchbury had to design around. Now, talking of great locations, this is in Tasmania, which is the southernmost island state in Australia. It's much cooler, it's more isolated. In fact, it's one of the most isolated parts of the world, and it's a very beautiful place. And you might just spot in the lower part here is a little house. And this is a house designed by Craig Rosevere, who is another young, upcoming Australian architect. I mean, I say young, I mean he must be 45 or 50. That's okay. And again, it's about maximising the location, maximising this fantastic site with this beautiful view across the bay. So, in many ways, when you have great architecture in a great location, my job is easy. So I can, how could you fail? And in making great pictures. And it's funny, but when it's a really good piece of architecture, it's actually it's hard work because there's so much to do. and I have to pare it down. I've only got a set amount of time. I can't just make pictures forever. I have to say so many things. I've got to cover so many aspects, and I have to work hard, which is fine. I like working hard. I get up early, and I stay up late. But again, I also have to explain the house. So there's certain, usually basic aspects that I have to cover. Different elevations, etc. And certainly the relationship of important things like, in this instance, the relationship of the interior to the exterior. Yeah, that was one of the big design aspects. And I can't ignore pictures like that. And yet, as far as I'm concerned, that is an architectural photograph. Isn't it? Indeed. Now, another similar house in that it's in a dramatic place. When I first saw this house, this building, sitting on this hill from a distance, I thought, that's it, that's what I'm going to photograph. And I thought, that is a monument to ego. There was this big steel thing like this. You know, it was some architect saying, here I am, I'm fucking amazing, look at me, aren't I wonderful? Now, thankfully, the architect was not like that at all, and once I walked with him around this building, which is his country retreat, it actually, from a design perspective, made complete and simple sense. So it's two steel tubes. The long one is facing east-west, and the shorter one on top is facing north-south. And it's there to maximise the views in the morning and in the evening, and to bring in light in the morning and in the evening, and to also offset the southerly winds from behind, shield themselves. And all these sort of basic things, again, it's just dealing with the location, dealing with the prevailing winds and the light and the weather. And he obviously had a reasonable budget to afford the Corten steel, but that's another thing. But it was actually a very simple, functional house, and I was greatly impressed. It's by Denton Corker Marshall. It's John Denton's house. So that sort of concludes the little highlight of the Australian recent projects. And now I just want to show you a few long-term commission projects. So in these three cases, they were documenting over 1 year, 2 years, in one instance several years, the transformation, the development, the demolition of one site, one building. This first one was in North Sydney, so an aerial picture to establish its context. Now, I was meant to photograph this for 2 years, the building of it, and of course, you know, they had to dig a big hole, and I love big holes, so I had lots of fun making some interesting pictures of hole digging. And of course, this was the aim of this picture. The aim of the brief was make some pictures. This is going to be a landmark building, and we're going to make a book about this. And I was very excited by this, and really, you know, I could do whatever I wanted. I said to make X number of pictures. I had to visit there on a regular basis and present my work periodically, etc., etc. And this went on for about a year, and then I got a phone call to explain that, oh, Richard, you know, the global financial crisis, I have to make some cuts, and you're one of them. So halfway through, that was the end of that. But nonetheless, It's not the first time that's happened. I had lots of fun along the way, and that's just the way it is. And this project, which is in London, it's called 33 Holborn, which was a building designed by Foster & Partners. This project was a similar one. It was documenting the demolition of this building, which is the old Daily Mirror newspaper building, and then the subsequent erection of this Foster commercial building. So again, this was actually an art project. They were going to make a book, they were going to have an exhibition, and likewise with the other one, it never eventuated for circumstances beyond my control. But again, you know, I'm very interested in this, the process, the transformation process of buildings. I think one of the great things about photography is that we do capture that moment. Yeah, and it's very different to a film. In that film is flowing, it moves, you're constantly being taken from one image, one idea onto others, but with a still image, you know, that's it. And our job is to tell that story in that moment and make the most of it. And I like the idea of telling lots of single moments throughout a long process. I think that's interesting. So again, these pictures, I'm thinking one picture, that has to be able to stand on its own, but it also has to relate to the pictures that preceded and the pictures that follow. It has to be able to tell a story. And I love doing that. I love working in series because it just, it gives you opportunities to go beyond the one-off idea. I also like working in colour and in black and white. And depending on the project, I might do both, as I did in that one, or I might choose one or choose the other. Certainly the commercial commissions almost invariably are colour. So it's kind of nice to be able to revert back to black and white. Now this project, the Tate Transformation, is probably my biggest and most important, well it is my biggest and most important single project. From 1994 through to 2000, I documented the transformation of this building, which back then was the Bankside Power Station, a decommissioned power station, and its transformation into Tate Modern, which is the world's most popular art gallery. And first of all, I went in there and just made pictures of the remnant workings of the power station. And they literally did, when they decommissioned it, they just sort of pulled all the plugs out and walked out. Yeah. And this first time when I went in, an engineer was sort of caretaker, and he showed me around and he said, "Don't go up there, it's a bit dangerous, but you can go down there," and all that. And then he said, "Okay, well I'll leave you to it then. Just throw the latch on the door when you leave." And I had this whole power station to myself. You know, it was fantastic. And the doors were like this high, you know, and I had to throw a little padlock on it, you know, when I left, which was wonderful. And of course, the next stage was when they ripped everything out, all right? So Herzog de Meuron were the architects, and they were very interesting. They kept true to the original design interior layout. So there's this central, yeah, which is the skylit space you can see there on your left, and to the right, that housed all the machinations of the power station. And of course now, it houses the different levels of art gallery space, right? But otherwise, it's a building. The building is hardly redesigned at all. It's a big open atrium space, or it's multi-level gallery space. So again, I was working in colour and in black and white, and going in probably on a monthly basis, and just making the pictures that I wanted to make. But I was very aware of, I just didn't make silly esoteric images. I wanted to